Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. Today's topic will be the utility of anger and aggression, and together we'll take a look at questions like: is there a difference between anger and aggression? Where does anger usually come from? What is the utility of anger from evolutionary perspective or biologically? What can happen if we don't learn to work with our anger, and how can we use it efficiently, especially in today's modern world? How to refine our anger into something useful and productive, and much more. So let's just jump straight into it. First, let's get our terminology straight. So, what's the difference? Anger versus aggression. It's pretty simple. Anger is an emotion. It's very natural, and because it's an emotion, it's out of our conscious control. It just appears based on certain stimuli. Aggression, on the other hand, is an action. It's oftentimes expression of anger, but because it is an action, it is in our control. It's also worth mentioning that aggression often stems from anger. Okay, so that's the difference, anger and aggression. But why do we even get angry? Because usually it's not a very pleasant feeling, right? Being angry, it can be also exhausting. But as I mentioned, anger is a very normal, natural emotion, and a perspective we can take on anger is that it serves as sort of an indicator telling us that something has to change, that things are not okay like they are. It can also be useful when facing challenges. It's basically our body's response to a threat that can be real as well as only perceived. It's also worth mentioning that anger itself is often tightly tied with fear, but we'll touch on that a bit more later. However, because anger is such an intense emotion, it needs an outlet. Otherwise, it turns inward, causing all sorts of problems. And here, that's where, from my perspective, aggression comes in. Aggression or aggressive behavior has also been conserved by evolution for a certain reason. It helped us protect ourselves, helped us gain higher place in social hierarchies, gain resources, etc. And one of the studies I was researching when preparing this episode described in most cases, aggression is a normal and necessary component of social behavior. So it's really ingrained in our evolution, our biology, would say. But again, I want to bring your attention to what I said initially, that because it is an action, it's in our control. And that will be very important during this whole episode. So, in truly ancient and primitive fashion, probably the first thing that comes to your mind when hearing the word aggression is violence. Violent behavior, danger, and destruction. Something along those lines, right? And absolutely, that can also be part of it. However, I would like to distinguish between destructive and productive aggression, or that's at least how I would call it. The difference, of course, being that the first type of aggression only destroys, burns everything in its path, and often even the person who acts it out. Nothing good usually comes out of it. Here you can imagine your typical crash outs, escalated road rages, or unnecessary bar fights, for example. On the other hand, the productive aggression is sort of constructive. It helps you build or create something, whether it be a new physique, better career, business opportunities, new circle of friends, or completely new and different life. When looking at the productive aggression, I would say that it is sort of a fuel for the change in your life. So if we take anger as being an indicator of something being wrong and not okay in your life, productive aggression then can truly serve as a catalyst for change, which sometimes is necessary, right? And I like that it still has that underlying violent quality to it. It's just now been refined into something more positive, productive. Unfortunately, in order to change something, you'll still probably have to destroy something. Because one thing has to come down so other can stand in its stead. That's basically the nature of change. And it's true even for yourself. If you want to change, you'll have to first destroy your bad habits to build positive ones. For example, if you want to get into shape, you have to kill that part of you that just wants to lie down and eat cake all day. We also had an interesting conversation with my friend. He proposed that aggression is always actualized at the expense of someone else. And the example given was sports. A successful aggressive strategy is played at the expense of the opponent, right? And I guess that sometimes it can be the case, or at least it may seem that way. However, the aggressive strategy is also typically played at the expense of safety and the risk-free play of the first team. And in this example, any strategy, at the end of the day, is at the expense of the opponent, because it's sports. So I would argue that it's not necessarily because of the aggression, but more due to the zero-sum nature of the game and perhaps sports in general, that it's at the expense of someone. However, there is still merit to the original thought, especially if we are talking about the idea of productive aggression. I think that the one at whose expense it will be is you yourself, at least usually. And this goes back to the original idea of man being both the sculptor and the marble, right? This also fits well with into what you learn, for example, in psychotherapy, that there are many different versions of you within yourself. And all of these versions have different needs, attitudes, learned behaviors, etc. And sometimes one of those versions has the main voice and leads the rest. Other times it's a different one. To give you an example on myself, there is a lazy Mark who just wants to be comfy and not bothered all the time. There is, for example, people-pleasing Mark who fears very much to disappoint other people. There's also ambitious Mark who has big dreams and wants to achieve them, etc. You can go on. I think you get the idea. All of these versions have different needs and ambitions, goals, etc. And to tie this to the previous idea, if you bring change into your life, especially by the intense means of productive aggression, one of those versions will get stronger at the expense of a different one. And it's just up to you which versions of yourself you will decide to cultivate. I remember also Jordan Peterson, I think it was him, talking about this in even more intense manner. In order to change, a part of you must literally die so that a new one can take its place. So, to sort of bring this part all together, to get angry or frustrated about something is natural and normal. It's an indicator that tells us something probably needs to change. It's an impulse that has served us for thousands of years in the past. And we can act based on it, which will oftentimes result in aggression. Not necessarily though, but often. However, it's important to distinguish between destructive and productive aggression. Of course, we should try to channel our emotions into the latter, which, even though is not destructive, it keeps some of its violent foundations. And because of that, it can serve as a very potent and efficient fuel, acting as a catalyst of change in some area of your life. An example that for sure most of my probably male listeners, at least, will resonate with can be using anger and frustration, as well as other emotions, from heartbreak as a fuel for self-improvement. in the gym, into exercise or other sport, pouring the emotions into motions. It's also important to advise caution, because anger, because it's such a potent and powerful fuel, you can easily get burnt on it, right? In the example of working out, it could be getting too carried away by the initial emotions to the point of hurting yourself, maybe even permanently. Because in the gym, while exercising, you just start to see red, you get carried away by your emotions, and you just start ego lifting, you don't properly warm up, you ignore some signals of your body, and you just hurt yourself. So yeah, anger, very potent fuel, a propeller that can really skyrocket your productivity efficiency. I would say especially in sports or exercise, working out, because there's still that physical quality to it, or physicality, which can be very well used to burn that fuel. But be careful, because you also can get burned. And to quote Kratos from God of War, when he's giving his son Atreus his knife, he says, "Power in this weapon, any weapon, comes from here," and points to Atreus' heart, "but only when tempered by this," and points to his head, "by discipline, the self-control of the one who wields it." And I think that's very similar to aggression. You can harness its power and use it, but you must stay cautious and tempered. You must remain in control and not let the emotions overpower you or carry you away. And to give you one last example of the difference between destructive and productive aggression, if we bring back the scenario of a breakup and heartbreak, destructive aggression here could be letting your anger take control of you, yell at your ex-girlfriend, call her names, let out all the frustration at her. And in the end, you simply hurt another person, destroy the relationship with someone who previously cared for you deeply, and you yourself feel like a complete asshole immediately after the outburst episode. I'm simplifying, of course, but I think you can imagine the scenario. Productive aggression, on the other hand, could be what I mentioned previously, using the anger as a fuel towards a goal. In the gym or career, changing bad habits, you can turn the emotions towards parts of you that you don't really like. You say to yourself, "Jesus, I'm a lazy fuck. I'm changing that today," right? You get angry at yourself, and that forces you to change. And the intensity of the initial anger will be refined into motivation, determination, and action, perhaps even courage. I also want to mention that it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to some physical action. That's probably something that most of us imagine when thinking about using anger or aggression as a fuel for something. The idea comes to our head of the guy smashing the weights in the gym or smashing the boxing bag or whatever. And sure, as I mentioned, it's maybe one of the best areas or areas where it's easiest to use the anger. But it can be whatever, basically. You can get angry at yourself because you're lazy and you are procrastinating on your assignments to university, and you just angry, "Jesus Christ, I'm so fed up with this fucking assignment," and you just sit down and hammer at it, and you just pour your frustration into it, basically, and it gets shit done, right? Maybe that's the main message. Aggression and anger can get shit done. But again, be careful how you use it. Another example, or a note I would like to add, or interesting thought, is that it doesn't work only on the personal level, but also, I would argue, on a societal level. For example, take revolutions. Revolutions are usually, not always of course, but usually caused by some deep frustration or anger in society, which forces the people to come together and protest the regime or change it. And it's true that revolutions oftentimes get violent. That's where you can see the emotions taking over the people. The people are not in control then. But there are also instances of peaceful revolutions. For example, Velvet Revolution in Czech Republic in the 1989, right? So another example, the scale changes, but the principle stays the same, I think. So by now, I hope you have in your mind a pretty good idea of the refined aggression that I'm trying to evoke here, as well as its utilities and dangers. And now, because a big part of our lives consists of work, I was also interested in the relationship of anger or aggression and work productivity specifically. Because I think it's easy to recommend someone to use his anger for exercise. As I mentioned, it's the first thing that comes to your mind. But what if they are in a very professional environment, can't find a suitable outlet, and have to keep all the communication and behavior formal? What then? There is a study I came across, described in an article called Positively Channeling Workplace Anger and Anxiety, that took a closer look at anger at the workplace and its links to productivity. And I will quote here: "The key to channeling anger and anxiety into productivity is to recognize one's own needs and one's desire for dignity, validation, and respect. Understanding the causes of anger and anxiety is the first step in experiencing anger in safe and constructive ways while accepting personal responsibility for one's life and actions." I'll skip ahead. "Employees can channel anger positively by learning to meet their own needs rather than blaming others for their problems. In addition, honoring feelings rather than struggling to control them is essential to mental health." This study finds that to channel anger or anxiety into peak productivity, one must first acknowledge the emotion itself, as well as the sometimes hidden need behind it. And it seems to me that the big part of reaching that peak level of work productivity in this scenario lies in making sure your emotions, anger, frustration, anxiety, whatever, don't hinder your efficiency, rather than just using them as fuel for performance. As we talked about, perhaps that is more suitable for different scenarios, right? And interesting is also the mention of accepting responsibility for your actions, fate, and future. To me, that sounds very much like certain Stoic ideas, accepting what happens no matter what, being in control of your reactions, not blaming others for your emotions, etc. Just a mention, which I found very interesting. But yeah, from this you can also see the other side of the same coin. You can use the anger and aggression into something productive, as we talked about, use it as a fuel for, to give you energy and to the impulse to change something, to build something better. But in certain scenarios, it might be better or more effective to just focus on the emotions not hindering your efficiency. We also touched on that because anger is a very, very potent emotion, very intense one. It's easy to get carried away by it. So I think that this is a fair point, that one must be careful not to get carried away, because then it's very easy that it will hinder or slow down your work, or you will make unnecessary mistakes, right? So that's also another approach. And now, in the last part of the episode, I would like to turn our attention to what can happen if we ignore our emotions, anger specifically, and we try to push them down, suppress them, drown them inside of ourselves. And here I will draw a lot from a book, Mozaika Duše, Mosaic of a Soul, translated into English, by Kvapilík, a Czech author, which I'm reading currently, and I think it's a brilliant book. So if you are a Czech, I recommend it wholeheartedly. Unfortunately, I don't think there is a English version yet, but if I have some Czech listeners, they can check it out. So, sometimes it can be hard to work with our anger, right? Or to even see the possibility of it being something positive. Perhaps we've been taught from a very young age that anger is a bad emotion. Maybe we were socially rejected if we showed our anger, and we simply learned to suppress it and not show it. For me, at least partially, that rings very true. However, I again want to reiterate that anger is completely natural and normal emotion. And perhaps now, after listening to this episode, you can even see why. So don't suppress it, don't shy away from it, don't be afraid of it or even ashamed of it. Rather, learn how to work with it and use it. One of the dangers of suppressed anger is that if we ourselves don't take it into consideration, we don't pay attention to it and acknowledge it, it will find a way itself to express itself, usually in a pretty destructive manner. Then you get the out of nowhere and out of control outbursts, arguments, and emotional explosions. Maybe you have lived through something like that. If you have experienced something like that firsthand, you know that it's not very pleasant for anybody around or productive in solving anything. So that's why my advice would be to take control yourself and consciously use the emotion for its intended purpose. As another danger I want to mention is that sometimes if we suppress emotions for longer periods of time, anger, frustration, whatever, our body will take it upon itself to inform us that something is wrong. The inner harmony was broken, basically. That usually takes shape of some chronic illnesses, sicknesses, psychosomatic problems, or other health problems, as well as overall bad mood and low energy that usually entails all this. And again, I have to say, I probably experienced something like this, and it's not very pleasant. No. And of course, in the extreme cases, if your anger can't find other outlet, it can lead us to self-harm, which is an example of out-of-control behavior. Our psyche basically can get so frustrated that it has to do something, and if we don't consciously allow it, or even acknowledge the emotions, the impulses, it can turn to basically self-destruction, which of course is a very, very bad thing. So please, for the sake of you as well as other people around you, learn about your emotions, your anger, and try to find what they are trying to tell you and how you can utilize them. Hopefully this episode gave you a good enough idea on how that can look. And with that, I have to bring this episode to an end. I hope you learned something new. I hope that I have perhaps inspired you to be open to the possibility of anger as a useful tool, not something to be afraid or ashamed of. And now, go out there, listen to what your anger tells you, and become the bringer of change you want to see in your life. Good luck, and goodbye. Hear you soon.